Okay, hello again. I hope you are well and thank you very much for continue join our sessions in this Hackathon, AIMS Hackathon 2025. This is our fourth session, and wait a minute, I will stop sharing my screen. This is our fourth session, and today we are going to be talking about responsible and ethical development of AI for good. This session will examine the principles, challenges, and practical applications of building responsible AI systems for social good with a focus on applications against modern slavery and advising broader human rights issues. Speakers, who in this case represent the academia, industry, and even global initiatives, will address how AI can be aligned with UN goals and the AI for Good movement, why community for design and ethical frameworks are critical, and technical and governance challenges such as data scarcity, bias, privacy, and trust. This panel is going to be facilitated by really global experts, people that have been working on the field during several years and that has a particular sensitivity and knowledge actually about the responsible and ethical development. I'm pleased to welcome Jérôme Solis, Davor Orlic, Mayank, sorry, Mayank Kishbar, Phil Bennett, Allison Cohen, and Brian Ulicny, sorry for my pronunciation of the last names. Thank you very much for being here, for making some space in your agenda to share with us today. So first, I'm going to let you introduce yourselves so everyone in this call can know more about your role, about what you do, a little bit more about your background. So, Jérôme, would you like to go first?
Sure thing. Thanks, Sebastian. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. So I'm Jérôme. I'm a Senior Director of Applied Projects at Mila. So Mila is a research lab focused on machine learning out of Montreal, Canada. And my role really is at the intersection of AI for good, AI, and adoption. And so I come in with a background in product management and tech. And I'll talk a bit more about like what this actually means in the context of building AI for good projects a bit later on. But yeah, so I'm a trained PM. My background is in physics from my undergrads and electrical engineering in my master's, which I haven't used much, speaking, but the thinking around using science to the scientific process, let's say, to do good using AI is definitely relevant in this context. So yes, I won't spoil too much, but a bit more.
Thank you, Jérôme. Welcome. Mayank, please introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, I'm Mayank Kejriwal. I'm a associate professor here at the University of Southern California, where I run a group called Artificial Intelligence and Complex Systems, or AICS. I've been working on using AI to fight human trafficking for about 9 years now. So this is a problem of great importance, and glad to be here.
Thank you, Mayank. It is always a pleasure to have you here. Brian, please.
Sure. Yeah, Brian Ulicny. I'm here representing Design for Freedom, which is a group out of Grace Farms in Connecticut. This is the campus behind me, and advertising the Design for Freedom Summit in 2026. Maybe some of you would be interested. Design for Freedom is an NGO that brings together architects and construction people and supply chain folks. And the goal is to eliminate forced labor from the built environment. So we look at both the labor side of building and construction, but also the material side. So there's a lot of hidden forced labor in building supply chains. And it's really been a very interesting movement to have architects and construction companies and so on come together and commit to eliminating forced labor from the built environment in somewhat the way that similar people got together and said, we're going to make buildings green and commit to making environmentally sound buildings. So that's the group that I'm representing here, and I'm a computational linguist by training, a semanticist. So I use NLP, natural language processing techniques to bring to bear on these issues. So excited to hear what everyone else has to say.
Now, welcome, Brian. And wow, we would love to learn more about actually the role of the building and the design industry in the fight against modern slavery. Phil, welcome.
Hi, yeah, welcome everyone. So my name is Phil Bennett. I'm an independent technology consultant, and for the last 10 years I've been spending a large proportion of my time, and in fact all of my time really over the last few years, supporting organizations tackling human trafficking and modern slavery around the world. I work both with very, very small frontline organizations as well as some of the largest UN agencies, and including various collaborations such as Tech Against Trafficking, an advisor, and also the World Economic Forum. So hopefully I'll be able to bring some expertise related to how to build technology successfully with frontline organizations. My background is in commercial IT. So before I was worked with as a CXO advisor for some very large software companies and also systems integrators. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Phil. And Davor, you joined on time. Sorry you had the wrong link, but welcome, Davor. We are introducing ourselves, telling the participants a little bit more about our roles and backgrounds. So feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, no problems. And I'm sorry for the mess up. I was on a different link. Checking my emails as one does. But yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm with IRCAI, which would have been the International Research Center in AI under the auspices of UNESCO. So that means that we are essentially a machine learning group, but we're connected through the Slovenian government with UNESCO headquarters in Paris, which kind of like makes us part of the UN family, I'd say. And actually, just next week we are renewing our UNESCO status with a 3-day long meeting where we'll be presenting all of our achievements in terms of the center itself, but also with the UNESCO principles. But in essence, the center sort of like follows the mission of UNESCO as the education and science agency of the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Davor. And finally, Allison Cohen, welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here, and it's nice to meet everyone. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Allison, and I've worked in the past. I sort of come from an academic background in international development, global affairs, and I had been building applied AI, socially beneficial applied AI projects for about the last 5 years, and recently moved from sort of a nonprofit academic space into the startup world, so a very different set of incentives, but very interesting to be involved in building AI tools that are sort of being deployed and adopted. And I'm currently working as the chief of staff at a company called Liquid AI. And I am very passionate about building solutions that ultimately help people. And I had been responsible and involved with a project that was designed to support human trafficking survivors, which really links to today's conversation. So excited to be here and excited to meet you all.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. And wow, what a wonderful panel we have today. Like everyone is working on AI, on technology, but from different industries, from different organizations and perspectives. So first, I would like to invite Davor and Jérôme to share some insights in terms of responsible development of AI for social good, in this case, from the UNESCO's perspective and also from the academic angle. So Jérôme or Davor, feel free to decide who wants to begin.
Jérôme, you can go ahead, no worries. I have a couple of slides that I wanted to share with the participants, if that's okay.
That's
Awesome.
completely
So,
okay,
well,
yeah.
why don't I start? I don't have slides, unfortunately, at this point, but I can let Davor after that do the work. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, awesome. I'll try not to take too much time. I have a tendency to keep babbling. All right, so I think the first thing, and this is coming from a product manager that joined the academic world. The first thing that really kind of caught my eyes in terms of developing impactful, AI solutions for good was the need to really design for community first. I think in academic setting, especially, there's a tendency to really think, tech first, like, oh, let's look at this cool new model, this new approach, and let's figure out what it solves in the future. When we've been building products, and especially when you want to have social impact on different communities, really working with the communities at the core of what you do is critical. And that means actually like going and meet with them and having more of like the social science aspect of the work, which is meeting with them, doing some actual ground research work to understand what's their situation, what is their pain point, how are they living through the situation that you're trying to explore, and being very humbled about what you know and also what you don't know. I know Ali might talk a bit more about this later, but one of the big projects we worked on with human trafficking victims, was very humbling because you have to meet with them and understand like what is their reality, which it's not something you can imagine if you haven't been through this very difficult situation, horrific situation. And so, learning from them, understanding also what's the relationship with the other stakeholders, right? These systems are very complex. There's just not one type of persona, there's many types. And so understanding how the relationship works and all of this, it will inform how the technology is going to be deployed, how it's going to be work, and also how it's going to be adopted, at the end, which is where the impact, takes shapes. And so I just can't stress enough the importance of designing for someone and going out there and like, meeting with these people and actually learning from them and having them as, part of the like the development process of your project. And what's fun about this is that all that very heavy lifting work that you do very early on will pay off in the very long term as well, because very often the problem space you're learning from like will stay the same for a certain period of time where technology has a chance to evolve. And we have examples in our projects, where, for example, we worked on field delineation for smallholder farms in Africa. Very difficult problem from a technical standpoint, but they can have a lot of impact locally. But all of the challenges that you learn about the communities there, this is informative. But now with the advancement of like segmentation, like SAM models, segment anything models, sorry, that's the name I had. Segment anything models, like you don't need that much training data to do the kind of work you needed, like, tremendous amount of data collected on the ground in the past. And so the definition of the problem you had done previously is still, relevant today. And now you have technology that allows you to actually, drive faster towards impact. And so really working with the communities, understanding what they're going through, is something that will be very rich in terms of insights and for the a fairly long time. And what else? And yeah, and finally, like I said it a bit before, but be very mindful about the diversity of persona that can be impacted in with a project, with technology, with AI, and make informed and thoughtful decision about who you want to prioritize now. And saying no to certain scope today doesn't mean saying no forever. It just means that today I'm focusing on this scope, and then moving on, I might expand that a little bit more. We had experiences building chatbots or knowledge management system. In one case was for the OECD, so very international. For another case, it was more local here to help people with filing reports for children with handicaps. There are so many people you can work with and you can empower, but you have to make good decisions on like who you want actually to focus on first. And so be opinionated there and really always be prioritizing, I think is a key point here. How am I looking on time? Do I still have a bit of time? I just realized this took more time than I thought. So yeah, so that's my big point, and again, this preaching for my own choir, like the PM world is really that kind of getting empathy for the user, but I think it really helps driving change and building technology that matters. And then I think one of the key work as well is to translate all of those insights into actual requirements for applied work. And that's where the multidisciplinary nature of building technology today really comes into play. It's not just, ML engineers and software developers, kind of building these work. We need to collaborate with designers, with social scientists, with social workers, with people on the field to build, technology that works. And so I cannot stress enough just the multidisciplinary nature of this work. And AIMS is actually a great example of just how many different expertise had to meet in order to build such a data set that, was so rich, but also some benchmark and some insights that actually can also be useful for, the broader community. And so the multidisciplinary, definitely a big one. And that's a big thing for me, which I love. And I think for research, it also really helps, but like mock your work and research insights and do that as soon as you can. So once you're in things and you want to try, like, don't be afraid to just, write, draw something or just create something that's fake, just to get some first feedback from the communities into like how this would actually work. And I think in the context of an hackathon, that could be very empowering, is to, let's brainstorm, let's have some ideas, and let's already get there and like kind of get some feedback from people from the field so that we can help, steer a little bit our work into something that would actually drive impact. And, we don't need to write code for this. It's just a nice draw.io figure can go a very long way. And so some burst of creativity can be very impactful. And finally, yeah, like of course, iterate fast. I think to deliver like meaningful applied work, we need to ship fast and not wait months and sometimes even years before having something in the hands of the communities. Things can always be simplified. We can make hypothesis about what we want to ship first, but that's a big challenge for us, is always like figuring out, okay, this 3 to 6 months roadmap, like how do we actually break that down into smaller chunks that we can actually present and get feedback from. And so that cycle of agile development really key. And these are all like lessons that we've learned, I guess, across our various projects. The final one I would say is also just test stuff. I think in AIMS there was a lot of tests that were done, and benchmarks is a great example of just testing. Especially now with all the Gen AI, systems that are out there and are very powerful, it does bring a lot of challenge around like, well, what actually works best? Is this, will this work in different various contexts? And so always be thinking about how can we test this approach in a very like, robust way. And actually that's where we learn a lot from our academic colleagues. In academia, when you're trying to prove a theory or prove a new system, you actually are testing a lot and often. And so that rigor, that scientific rigor, is really well positioned in the context of building, impactful technology and products to be also, to also be used. Yeah, so I think I will wrap up what I had there, unless Davor kind of share his own insight. What I'll finish is just maybe some key points in my own perspective of what makes a good pitch. Because I have the honor of being also a judge, and I love a good pitch. And so I think for me, what I'm looking for is like, just get that empathy for the community, the persona, the user that, you'll be trying to empower or impact with your technology. And so, really take some time at the very beginning to just tell us, who is this for? What is the problem it solve, and what is the value you're trying to deliver to your user? Just like taking a small time at the beginning to just set the stage will really go a long way to understand, okay, like, can I put myself in the shoes of that person and see just how different my life might be with the use of AI in that way. And then usually you start with this, then you have your amazing pitch with like the technology you've built and some of the things you found. And then what I also love is at the end, talk about future opportunities. There's a big chance that you took a lot of time to just explore a lot of ideas, and there's probably a lot of very interesting insights that came out about where this could go. Feel free to share that. I think it gives also continuity to your work, and it can actually bring maybe other people to also join you, and maybe there's opportunities for different work to actually collide and make a bigger initiative. And so feel free to share also where you think The work that you worked on might actually go in the future and how we could use that for doing even better good. All right. I hope I stayed within my time limit. Davor, the floor is
Yes,
yours.
and actually we have 2 hours almost, so don't worry, you can take your time.
Go ahead.
But it really resonates with me. So designing for community first. Actually, we are going to go back to that particular point in our questions, but thank you for sharing that insights and that actually we feel that you are sharing from your real experience, like designing for communities, working with communities, and those pieces of advice are really useful in this process. Of course, our participants maybe are not going to have like the opportunity to work with communities during this hackathon. We only have a couple of dates, but it's really important to consider for who are they designing. And actually yesterday we had the opportunity to talk with a human trafficking survivor from Mexico. So guys, you already know what she said, like what she's asking for, like the needs that she had along the process, and actually the petitions that he were emphasizing. It's important to consider to actually fight against human trafficking and modern slavery and identify victims on time. So that kind of insights is something that you should consider while designing your solutions. Davor, the floor is yours. Please feel free to share
Yeah,
slides.
I really liked what Jerome said. It really resonates, especially the part of the sort of like partnerships and implementation and all these like stages within like the AI or any technology sort of like cycle. Um, I'm in two minds whether I should share my slides and just talk or should I show them like you tell me.
You can share your slides in
Yeah.
like in the rest of the presentations. We have a mix like
Okay, cool.
presentations and
Uh,
slides, so it is cool. You can
cool.
share.
Then let me just give a bit of context. So when how should I put it? Um, the problem with, let's say, with AI today would have been that the major companies are running really, really good and powerful research labs. And they're obviously chasing their own goals, which would have been corporate, but also underneath all of that, if you dig in, there's always this idea that, it's not just that. But we had to make sure that to understand that for ourselves. So what we've done is um, in the AI sort of ecosystem, you would have, researchers, then you would have for-profits, non-profits, NGOs, right, charities doing a lot of work. Then you'd have obviously startups, and then you'd have the big tech. So it has become a policy and governance. So it has become a really complex sort of like ecosystem, right? So how do you kind of like pull together all of these elements into one, call it project, if it even exists? And given that this hackathon is really close to our mission and close to our minds, um, I would like to show you a situation where you as the participants, you'll be doing the same um, once you're whatever employed or you finish your PhDs or whatever you're out there. So the principle of the hackathon, which would have been, a technical answer to a technical problem, is also a mission answer to a mission problem or question. So you always kind of like the human and the machine side is always kind of like stitched together with a layer of kind of like business in between, whether profit or non-profit. So we kind of like created this fellowship with technology companies in the climate space. But the idea was, how can we offer to these companies a supercharge in the AI space? So how should they go about using AI to supercharge whatever their mission is? And we kind of like succeeded, but we're still trying to understand how do we go about this. So maybe I could just share these slides with you guys and then bear with me. Okay. Can you see the full screen?
Not the full screen, but we can see the slides.
All right, yeah. So
Perfect.
I've changed the slide. Does it change? Does it flip?
Yeah. Now
Yeah,
we
okay.
can see a full screen, yes.
Yeah, so first of all, Adriana is essentially a winner of our research award for 2021. So there's a bit of marketing for the owner of the hackathon. So very proud of her. But I'm gonna skip this. So this is about IRCAI. I'm gonna skip this, and this is about UNESCO and the context of UNESCO. So I'm gonna skip that as well, but we can come back to this. But essentially, it's sort of like a gateway. But I'm going to come to the climate partnerships. So we created this thing which is called the Compute for Climate Fellowship, right? Which is an R&D funding program that would have empowered climate tech startup to leverage advanced cloud computing and AI, right? In the so-called fight against climate change. But essentially what we're doing is we have 25 companies which will build groundbreaking 2 to 3 months projects. Now, these are quite big startups. Having said that, every startup, like any other legal entity, has a budget. And even though they have huge investments, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a budget for internal hackathons, so to speak. But they will, however, get that if the right players would have been in the right combination. So we partnered with AWS, and they're giving us $4 million in AWS credits because that is, what is needed for obviously running models, and giving grants up to $200,000 for each company to sort of like run the POC. And we would have been looking for proposals that would have been thinking big, obviously creating novel solutions to address the climate crisis. Now, before I move on, working with the people at AWS has been really lovely because they actually do incredibly think about climate startups, and this would have been with the climate business development department. So just to give you a bit more what a POC is to the audience. So a POC is a crucial step to validate concepts, manage and ensure that time and resources are used effectively before committing to a full-scale implementation. And that's exactly what Jérôme was kind of like saying, you have stages all the way to your goal. So either you do it here for this hackathon and you do it properly and you really aim to do something interesting, or you'll just have to do it, whenever you move forward in your career. So the startup would have at the bottom their core activity, and then the POC would come in, and then the startup would have a new core activity, right? Because the POC, the proof of concept, would simply change the nature of the company's activity. And obviously now the beauty is that you have the classical AI project cycle, but at the end, you have ethical and regulatory considerations. So this is where we come in. So we would say to the companies, look, guys, obviously AWS will give you money for the compute and so on, but we have to think about this and this and this and this and this, which translates into, responsible AI and ethical sort of stuff. So just one um, example. So Coastal Carbon, which is from Canada, they're building an AI-driven measurement platform that builds AI models using satellite imagery to track and measure underwater vegetation growth and carbon sequestration, right? So the POC would have been then to train satellite agnostic foundation models of Earth and sea that can identify and qualify ocean blue carbon, right? And then the result would have been to increase transparency and trust in ocean carbon removal, right? Facilitating up to 1,000 times increase in ocean monitoring and data collection capacity. Because before that, the data collection was done by divers, right? And these guys actually work with indigenous communities. So it's kind of like interesting. And then I have more examples with from the fusion space, from agriculture and water treatment and so on. But maybe this year we've also introduced a subsection of the call for indigenous communities, which honestly we didn't know how to go about this. So we asked our colleagues at UNESCO and the UN, and it turns out that indigenous communities are a whole concept which is not to be, overlooked and heavily complicated, but also makes a lot of sense. But essentially, we wanted to reach out to companies that are based within those indigenous communities, and we did. And I can show you more later on. But essentially, that's the idea, and we announced it in February. We got the results in July, and these companies are already running things. But just to say that I agree with Jérôme, there's a cycle, and the pitch is very, very important. The delivery is super interesting, and I think it's really worthwhile to engage with this hackathon because it just makes a lot of sense in today's time, I think, to come up with something that is really, should I say, not just a prototype, but something really working. That would be incredibly amazing to see. And as Jérôme said, I'm also part of the jury, so I'm really looking forward to see something incredible. I mean, look, incredible is working. If it works, it's incredible. And really happy to be here with this audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Davor, for sharing actually what your organization is doing. And I have to say something, as I'm from Colombia, and before this competition, and actually I work on this field, I didn't hear before about IRCAI and this particular initiative at UNESCO. And I can say that in many regions of Colombia and in Latin America, I mean, it is similar. So it is really awesome to know that also there is an organization like providing SOAR guidelines and trying, as you mentioned, to coordinate all the efforts and the developments. And I think that there is an important need actually to continue promoting what you are doing in different regions, because I think that it could benefit
Thank you.
the communities, the organizations, the companies that are working on this field. So happy to learn more about this directly from you, and it would be awesome to share more insights actually of your work and the work of IRCAI here in the region. Now I would love to open the mic for Allison to share your particular experience actually developing technology to address modern slavery and some of the lessons that you have learned during that process.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So yes, I'm excited to be talking about a really specific project, and I'm hoping that in describing the details of this project, we can sort of get into a fresh example of what it might look like to implement some of the practices that are being described by Jérôme and Davor. So the project that we had been building, this was specifically at Mila. For those who don't know, it's an AI research center based out of Montreal that has an explicit goal of designing AI tools that are designed for the support of humanity. We had been working on a project that came out of the research or the academic community that was designed to actually identify survivors and victims of human trafficking. And we were really excited about this tool. As you can imagine, it was a very meaningful project that off the bat got people very excited. And a key stakeholder group that we thought would be particularly excited about this was, of course, law enforcement. Isn't it so important that law enforcement has access to information about who might be a victim of human trafficking, and how important would it then be for them to intervene, help support the victim, free them from these horrific conditions that Jérôme also alluded to? How wonderful a solution could this be? And of course, the more that you engage with the field, the more nuanced and understanding you start to build about why it is someone might go into human trafficking in the first place. Maybe someone doesn't actually feel like they're being trafficked. Maybe they are being trafficked by their boyfriend, and they think that what's happening is fully consensual and not the least bit exploitative. Or maybe they depend on whoever's trafficking them for food and shelter, and being removed from those circumstances would actually be much more harmful than it would be helpful. And what we then realized was, as much as we think that it's important that there is a justice system and how great it is that there are such thing as law enforcement agents that go in and support human trafficking survivors. What we realized is, especially in the Canadian context, forcing an interaction or instigating interactions between law enforcement and survivors of human trafficking would actually, in many cases, be doing much more harm than good. And so we had to go back to the drawing board and figure out, okay, well, if what we're trying to do is support human trafficking survivors and law enforcement isn't necessarily the right approach for us to take, what would be the right approach? And so that's when we reevaluated sort of even the technology. Let's take the technology that we've built off the table. What are the key problems that human trafficking survivors are dealing with? And then we'll figure out later if the technology that we've built is aligned with helping them address it. And what we've learned is that human trafficking survivors really struggle with collecting evidence of their exploitation. They might not want to use that evidence in a court of law. They might want to use that evidence just to tell their employer, please believe me when I say that I've been exploited and that's why I've missed work. And can we make a special exception in light of what's happened to me? So what we realized we could do with this technology, instead of empowering law enforcement, is using it to empower survivors of human trafficking to tell a credible story. So all of the data that we had collected online that sort of demonstrates the likelihood that someone has been a human trafficking victim, they could then use that as part of their story. And they could use that in whatever context they wanted. Again, it could be in advocating for themselves to their employers. It could be in advocating for themselves and getting a restraining order. It could be in advocating for themselves to get placed in a shelter that has survivor-aware practices. And so that type of shift really changed the way that we built our technology, and the impact, of course, that technology would end up having among the survivor community. And when you are designing your AI tools, it's not just a question of what problem you're solving. It's also a question of how you've designed those tools to solve that problem. And when it comes to AI, I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with the fact that the way that you're designing the tools, there's many, levers that you can pull when you're designing AI tools, but one of the most critical has to do with the data that you're feeding into your models. And so, of course, as we talked about, it's so important to understand the domain from the affected community, but your understanding of the domain is one thing. You want to make sure the AI model understands the domain according to those affected communities as well. How do you do that? You make sure affected communities are deeply involved in the data set development process, in the data annotation process. And so I'll just give you a quick example of what we learned in working with human trafficking survivors. So the trafficking survivors flag things like, if you're looking online for signifiers of trafficking, tattoos might be relevant. Can we build AI models that can identify certain types of tattoos? What about emojis? Emojis might signal different things to different people. Survivors have an intimate knowledge of what that might be signaling. Whereas if you had just gone to, for example, law enforcement to help with your dataset development process, they might have said, we just need to find organized activity. We need to find overlaps in the way that people are being talked about online. And if you talk to survivors, that's actually not right, because there are many sex workers who we don't want to penalize, who we don't want to implicate in this work, who are also, you can find all kinds of patterns in the way that they're broadcast and advertised. And so we want to make sure we're picking up the right signal. So working with those communities in collecting, scraping the right data and annotating the right data, in teaching the AI models what is a indicator of trafficking is just so important. And I think that's especially the case with some of the new practices that are coming out now when it comes to data set development, which is specific in terms of creating synthetic data sets. You need to have a very robust understanding of the field if you build a data set yourself that you think is highly representative of the domain. So I want to make sure we flag that. How am I doing for time? I'm sorry, I just realized I might be going over a bit. Sebastian,
No,
can
don't worry. We have plenty of time. You can continue.
Okay, amazing. I'll try to wrap it up. So what I really encourage people to be mindful of is pushing back against the dominant practice when it comes to data set development, which is outsourcing. Outsource the data set development process, outsource the annotations. I don't think that's right, because unless you have people on your team who understand the domain, who you work with to develop strong annotation guidelines, you can't be sure that the models are inferring the right information from the data set. And so when we had built a data set at Mila in a very intentional way, it wasn't necessarily having to do with human trafficking, but it was designed to find misogyny, so bias against women. We were trying to create this whole corpus of data that exhibited nuanced ways that women were being discriminated against. And we had to think about things like how many women, we hired exclusively women to do the data annotation work because of the sensitivity they had to the field. But we had to think about how many women do we want per data point to make sure that we don't just get one woman's opinion, but we get multiple women's opinion, because these things are highly subjective. So you want to think about how many people are actually looking at that one data point. Are you taking a majority? Are you going to go with the most sensitive person's interpretation of that data? You can think about things like, do we want to create free-form text where the annotators can really incorporate that subjective opinion, or do we want to constrain them and have them be required to sort of categorize what they're seeing so that there's more continuity across your data set? So these are all really things that I thought added a lot of nuance and value to the data that we built, and then ultimately to the AI models that are being deployed. The last thing I'll leave you with is something similar to what Jérôme had said, which is you want to make sure you have really good intersectional representation among the people that you're consulting while building your data set. And that intersectional representation, the way I like to understand it is when you understand the domain and understand some of the people that are implicated in that domain. So for example, in human trafficking, you have many members of the Indigenous community, LGBT community, youth, racialized, particularly Southeast Asian community members. How do you make sure that a cross-section of each of those groups is well represented in your team, in your data set annotation process, and in your in the design and sort of launch overall? So hopefully that gives people sort of a more textured understanding of what this has looked like in some of the work that we've done before at Mila. And yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Oh, wow, Allison, now thank you for sharing that experience. And I mean, the word that come to mind at this moment to me is engagement, like truly engagement with the communities, and in this case with the human trafficking survivors. Like we have seen that there are a lot of exercise actually to consult human trafficking survivors, but this experience is going beyond that. Like you are getting involved then actively in the process to build the data sets, actually to really be involved in the data analysis and generation process. And I think that that's an incredible example, and actually obviously the direction that you know, not necessarily all, but a lot of tech tools should take, as I mentioned, not to only consult survivors, but actually get involved them and truly engage in the process to creating solutions that at the end are to benefit them and other people. So thank you for sharing that particular experience. And Mayank, you are also highly involved in a tool that use AI to fight child trafficking. Would you mind sharing some of the projects you have involved in, and you know, the experience that you have gained along that process?
Sure. So I'll share a few slides as well. Okay, so everyone sees my full screen, right?
Yep.
All right. So so this is a short set of slides I put together on some of the work that we have been doing and are continuing to do over almost a 10-year period now. So it's in 2026, it will be 10 years since I was first exposed to this problem. And we work on many different problems, but this is the one that is the longest running, and which is both a sad thing, and also it speaks to the power of the problem, that it never really leaves you. I think unlike some of these other problems where they're important, right, like health and crisis informatics, and these all important problems that we've dealt with in our group and we come back to once in a while. But the fighting human trafficking is really the problem where we're like, this should not be happening, right? And so if we can do anything, right, to make a dent, small or big, funded or unfunded, you feel that responsibility. So I hope that everyone participating in this event also takes that away, and in whatever way you can, you continue to work on the problem. So no effort is too small. Now, so if you're interested in our portfolio of projects, we're generally very interested in both the engineering side of things. So how do we use AI and technology to build solutions for complex problems? But we are also very interested in the science of the problem. How do we better understand what is human trafficking? How do we define it? How is it connected to, in the case of sex trafficking, how is it connected to sex work, right? What's the difference, and how do we best understand it? How do different organizations define it? So these are very, a scientific and a sort of sociological way of looking at it, which is equally important. I want to begin with a system that was really built over a period of 4 to 5 years and funded through DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So it's this agency that is more than 50 years old. It's really, they have a mission to do sort of really revolutionary research. So they have done things like build ARPANET, which turned into the internet, and Siri on your Apple phone came out originally through a DARPA program, and so on. So they have had some great successes, and so they went after this problem in a program called DARPA MEMEX, and which was, I would argue, also quite successful, what they did. So we were one of the participants in that program, and here I'm showing a very high-level architecture of a system called DIG, Domain-Specific Insight Graphs, DIG. And the mandate of the problem was that, we have Google, right, where we can go and search for things like, or you have Amazon, where you can search for a product. But, a law enforcement or an NGO or someone, if they want to search for someone who has gone missing, let's say an individual has gone missing, and there's reason to believe that they may be being trafficked. So that's one instance, but there are other instances, missing children, etc. If they are somewhere on the web, right, under the assumption that that person is being trafficked, and now they are advertising somewhere on the web, right? How can we build a system where they can enter whatever they know about the person, let's say some physical description or an image, right? Like the image you see when the person goes missing, right? This is a public domain image. Or the last known phone number or the last known location. I mean, there could be any number of details, and that's what you see here in this investigative schema, right? That's why we call this investigative. Can we build an Amazon-like system, which is what we call a domain-specific search system? So it is not generic, it is not Google, it's not meant for all search needs, but it is a domain-specific search system. Obviously kept very secure, only given to the right people. But we wanted to get public information from the web. So these are, for example, escort ads, etc. And then search, right, or give the investigator some ability to search the system to see whether there is any hope for finding the person, and then conducting an investigation. And in terms of AI and some of the technical work, I'm happy to go deeper into that, especially if there's time for Q&A later. But there was a lot of advanced technology that went into this. the technology that came out, especially on knowledge graphs. We ended up writing some books on this, including an MIT Press textbook. But we did a lot of work using knowledge graphs for the system. And the work we did was then transitioned to many other difficult problems as well. So it wasn't just for this problem, but this was the central problem for which we developed our methods. So after the program ended, it was the system was able to sweep up hundreds of millions of escort ads, and most of these are within the US, right? So it's not a developing or developed country problem per se. I think the problem exists almost everywhere. Unfortunately, right? So there were, now one thing I should say, I call these escort ads because these are sex work ads, but we have to be very careful. Something we have learned since then is that we cannot conflate, sex work and sex trafficking. So it's a very complicated issue, what the intersection is, because sometimes there's physical coercion involved, but in other cases, there may be socioeconomic coercion, and that's more difficult to quantify. So it's, a difficult problem to really understand what fraction can be called trafficking, right? But in either case, right, some fraction is trafficking and some fraction is underage, which under law is considered trafficking. It doesn't matter whether the child, 17-year-old, 15-year-old, consented or not. It is considered, even legally, that is considered, consent does not matter in that situation. It is crime, at least in US law and many other countries as well. So there were lots of data coverage that we extracted a lot of facts about, these are things like physical description and phone numbers and so on. So there were more than 2 billion facts. And as of 2019, this system, along with several others within the DARPA Mayank program, were transitioned to a lot of state law enforcement offices, which really, their technology is and was very primitive in some sense, right? They don't have access to really good technology that is even true today. And this was really given to them for free. It was led out of, I think, the New York office. And then we set it up in a way that it at least for a while, they were able to do it for free. And then I think they got access to really cutting edge technology and in a very competitive way. And there were several convictions where the actual traffickers were caught and the victims were rescued using systems like these, the combination of systems that came out of the program. So I'll show you some of the cases that were convictions, but I want to show you what the system looks like. So this is not publicly available, right? We were very careful to only give it to people who have jurisdiction. But you can sort of see that the system is giving you a lot of details. It is not perfect. There is noise, obviously, because it uses AI. But one way we dealt with the noise, right? And some of the speakers have spoken about design decisions, is that you never want to only go on the AI's predictions. You want to provide what's called a provenance. So in this case, we provided the actual URL, which might be taken offline, by the way, but it's at least, you can always check. You can click on the URL and then see that, okay, is it kind of, doing what we're seeing here? And are these extractions accurate, which are all, they were generated by AI. So there is noise, of course, when you use AI, but by providing as much information as possible in a human-friendly interface, you can do a lot, and foster trust in the system. And it can be done properly, but it's as much of a technological problem as a design problem and a social problem. So I want to emphasize that as well. And there's many useful things that could be done here. So one of the things we did was that to find trafficking networks, right? We would see which phone numbers were co-occurring. And if there were a lot of phone numbers co-occurring with each other, there was a good reason to believe that there was one or two traffickers that were controlling the whole thing. And this kind of interface, of what we call an entity-centric interface, because there's an entity like a phone number, and then you want to expand the entity and get all the information around it. So it was a powerful system. Again, we knew that it under the wrong hands, it could be misused. So it was never made publicly available. It was always given only to the right people. There are other systems that are kind of like it. One example is Spotlight, that is developed by the Thorn Foundation. Again, it's only available to investigators and to people who have clearance. Another one is, I believe, Marinus Analytics, which is a commercial company, and so on, right? So this is one of several products that were developed either within and in some cases outside the Mayank program. So for the hackers, here, right? It took a lot of engineering, so I don't want to underestimate the work that went into it. I think that now, what is so exciting is that we suspect that with the rise of cursor and generative AI, a lot of this coding could be done in much less amount of time than when we had done it, when it took years and we had to learn all these tools and we had to hire people who would learn these tools, and then we would write the code and test it and debug it. I suspect that if we were doing it today, we would be able to do 1.5 to 2 years worth of work in less than 3 months, probably. So that it's literally not exaggeration. I'm pretty confident that we would be able to write a lot of this code in much smaller amount of time. So, it's a very exciting time in some sense. You can really use code generation to build very powerful systems. And so this is user testimonials and press. I do want to emphasize that this is for MEMX, right? So all of these tools, including ours, were given to district attorneys, law enforcement, and so on, as a collection of tools, and we were all very collaborative in that process. We were like, let's give them the best tools, let's combine tools in some cases and build unified systems, because we want to make sure that our systems have impact and people can use the system. So that meant compromising and working together and building unified systems and putting aside egos that, hey, I built this and you built that, and will we get credit? And on this problem, we were like, if someone uses a part of what we built, then and something good happens, that's enough for us. We don't, and everyone, I think, in the program had that mindset, which was incredible, really. So there were testimonials from district attorneys' offices, and there were cases where people were traffickers, right, which are usually these older men, right, who were caught and evidence was found in these systems. And there were very convincing cases were made, and they could not claim things like, oh, our victims were consenting. In 1 or 2 cases, they claimed that, but the system was used to prove that that could not have been the case. They found evidence and were able to make a compelling case. In the early part of MEMX, right, what we also found was that the system really improved this from the New York office, that the MEMX tools, right, really improved increased the number of human trafficking investigations that went on. So you can see the exponential increase in 2015-16. This is right after the MEMX tools were first made available to the New York office, right? So there was an initial prototyping within New York, and then towards the end of the program, it was given to the 200 agencies. But you can see this is really promising. This is the promise of technology. This is the exponential kind of growth that you can get with the right technology. So many cases were opened up in human trafficking. And what is even more promising, I mean, this is the image that they gave us that I find to be really promising, that is kind of my go-to image, which is that what happened was that the blue, right, the total bars went down. And what these bars are prosecution arrests. So when the tool started getting rolled out, right, all these tools, the prosecution arrest went down, right, which is good. That means that the victims are getting victimized less. They are not being picked up by law enforcement. Then their boyfriends or their traffickers have to come and pay the bail. So now they are even more indebted, right? It's a vicious cycle. That is one of the, not the only way, but certainly it leads to lack of trust also in the system by the victims, right? So you can see it went down very significantly, but the fraction of those arrests that were then investigated for potential trafficking went from less than 1% to 62%. Now, under law, right, these human trafficking, once you open a case up for human trafficking, there are a lot of protections and resources that are afforded to the victim, right? So this was really incredible to see. Now, moving on quickly to what we're doing now. So this work ended around 2018-19. That's when the DARPA program ended. So we transitioned the tools, we got these testimonials and so on along the way, right? But then in 2018, so I don't know whether a lot of people here know about this, but there was a law passed in the US around that time where they took this big website called Backpage.com. It was a huge website. It was a dominant player in the sex work market. They also did a lot of other things, like when you would go on their website, you would see things like you see on Craigslist or Facebook marketplaces. You would see like furniture for sale and roommates and things like that. But 80% of their profits were coming from sex work advertisements. and a significant fraction of that was child trafficking, and they were turning a blind eye to that, right? So you can see there was a very concerted effort by 5 or 6 different federal agencies in the US. They shut down the website, they arrested a lot of people. A number of them started cooperating afterwards. The impacts of this are still continuing to be felt. I think this was in 2024 or 2025. But you can see that throughout the impacts were felt, and some of the trials just concluded actually. But you can see like these are, this is like really terrible in some sense, right? But this was happening on Backpage. So when this website was shut down and the CEO, etc., started cooperating, the agencies actually came, one of the agencies came to me. They had heard about the work that we had done. So they were like, well, can you help us find child trafficking victims within the Backpage data and also do more on the science of this? There's so much data in here. Can we learn more about how it grew? So where is Backpage focused? And they are all across the world. And how did this come around? How do we answer the scientific questions about online trafficking, right? So that's what we're working on. So this network that you see here is a real network. It is a sample of a US sex work network. We use Backpage data to figure out when sex workers are connected to each other. We have ethical approval, etc., to do this work, and it's we're very careful about it. But this is a real network, and you can see that it is fascinating. It does not look like a social network. If anyone has social network analysis experience, the social network is actually the 6 degrees of freedom that you might have heard about. That's kind of what you see in a social network. It's kind of connected, and it's much, it doesn't look like this. This looks like snowflakes, right? And so you can see there are big organizations. These are probably trafficking organizations. And you have trafficking organizations working with each other. There's a very star-like structure. So there's a very clear hierarchy. There are like 1 or 2 dominant sex workers. These are like the second in commands, if you will, right? Who kind of rose up through the ranks, right? They were themselves trafficked, but then they became traffickers. So it's very complex. Like when you actually see this domain, it is not a black and white kind of domain. It is very complex. And there are many questions we know nothing about, but that are answerable using the right data, or at least we can estimate or provide some answer. It would not be the end of the story, but there's a lot to learn. So we could study this for the next 10 years, but we are trying to hurry up and publish a set of papers as fast as possible at this point. I mean, COVID stopped us, unfortunately, for 2 or 3 years, but we are actively, working on studying in different portions of the world. We just wrote a paper and submitted it for review on the Asian countries, on 6 or 7 Asian countries, where we started this network. We are now working on the Caribbean region, which is also a hotbed of trafficking. We've published a paper on the UK. We will probably go to the Middle East next to see what's happening there and other places. So we want to look at all these hotbeds and see like what can we say scientifically in aggregate about what's happening in these regions, and what does trafficking or even sex work look like. So I'll end with this slide, which is that the questions we are looking at now is how can we best use this kind of data for, first of all, effectively advocating for trafficking victims and guiding policy through data. We are not policymakers. We don't really talk to policymakers except very occasionally. If they want help, we don't go to them directly. But we believe that it should be data-driven in some way. Like there needs to be, we should not be guessing, I think, on this important topic. If there is some way to get a data-driven scientific answer to some of the questions. And I think the much more longer-term plan, much more ambitious longer-term, is how can we understand and prevent trafficking at its roots? And certainly for sex trafficking, there's a very close connection to sex work. So we need to understand the sex work, right? And then the bigger question is, what is the difference between sex work and sex trafficking? And can we spot the signals? And how do we do that? And how does it come around? Like not even just detecting trafficking versus not trafficking, but what's the evolution? Like, is it, it's just that we kind of have qualitative evidence, from people who have been trafficked, right? But it's very small evidence and it's selective, and there is a selection bias, which is that the there are many individuals, the individuals who are being trafficked worse, may not feel comfortable speaking out at all. So it is possible that the people who are speaking out, including trafficking victims, the ones who are speaking out may not be representative of the whole population. That does not mean that we don't listen to them. We need every piece of evidence that we can get, but purely from a scientific perspective, we do have to be mindful of questions like how representative is the data that we have? How do we get more data? How do we look at different kinds of data? What's happening in different parts of the world? How does the legal framework affect what's happening in the different parts of the world? And so on. So there are 100 questions. Each question is equally important. And there are about 100 questions, I would say, not estimating, like literally 100 questions that we have written down. If we can address in some way, right, even 5 of those questions, I think I'll be happy. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Mayank, for sharing that experience. And actually, it is really nice to see like the tangible impact that it is having, like in terms of the investigations and the cooperation with the law enforcement agencies, which often is like the challenge that many tech solutions face. Like we develop a really good concept, it works, we have a whole team actually making it work, but then actually managing to make like convincing the key actors to use it and to integrate it into their operations is one of the main challenges. So it is really nice to see that actually you overcome that challenge and that actually you are cooperating actively with different organizations to actually help them to use this technology to improve the work that they do. That is pretty awesome. Uh, Phil, now I would like to welcome you. I know you have been working at the intersection of technology and modern slavery for many years, advising organizations from all over the world, and we would like to get some insights from your side in terms of what is key to creating AI tools that frontline organizations and affected communities actually trust and adopt.
Thanks very much, Sebastian, and hello everyone again. So as Sebastian said, I've spent a large amount of time over the last 10 years working with dozens of different organizations, particularly non-profit organizations, on this issue. And I want to give some hints and tips for success, particularly related, I suppose, to how non-profits can use technology, and what can be a good thing, but also some of the perils that are out there if we get it wrong. The first thing, which is good news, is that nonprofits are very innovative, and they have to be, because a lot of the IT budgets are extremely low, but they move very quickly as organizations. They're very flexible, they adapt to change a lot, and they are hungry for innovative ideas. So these are not organizations years behind. They are often on the very front lines of new technology that are being developed. The first piece of advice, particularly for technologists who are looking to try and tackle issues in this area, is don't work in a vacuum. By that I mean don't work just as a technologist on this, work with human rights experts. The reason for this is because human rights is immensely complicated, arguably more complicated than the technology that we're working with. It varies a lot over different regions and different countries, different parts of a country even. It is a complex topic, and this is why human rights experts often have PhDs, because it requires a lot of research. Some of the best NGOs will work locally, or have unique knowledge and expertise on what works and how to avoid harm. And so working with a non-profit is usually a very, very good way of avoiding potential issues. I mean, a few particular issues. Allison actually gave a few good examples of actually potential harms that can happen. Others, for example, if you're building an AI tool that might identify a factory that's exploitative, well, we might suddenly feel that shutting it down is a good idea, but what happens to those employees? If they become poorer, then they become potentially more vulnerable to exploitation than before, that's not a good idea. Or a solution that helps to identify a potential victim of trafficking, say at a hotel, well, if that leads to them being deported to a different country where they could be at more harm, then that's not a good outcome as well. So working with nonprofits helps to assure that the technology solutions don't cause as much harm and are relevant to the particular communities who are being affected. It's important because technology is an impact multiplier. Technology doesn't in itself do anything that's useful unless it's connected with people or organizations. So it can cause harm at scale if we're not careful. Any kind of implementation of technology with a non-profit organization initially in the first part of this is about closing the gaps between as a technologist, your understanding of the domain that you're working within and a non-profit's understanding of what's possible with that technology. Once you sort of focus on that, then a more collaborative approach to building technology begins, and it's more conducive to success. So rather than building tech for an organization, co-developing this is really a useful way of thinking about how this can be done. As has been said by a few others, I think on the call on this webinar, I think involving people with lived experience is a very useful way of improving the likelihood of success. There are now a lot of survivor groups who are have connections with consultants with lived experience, and the way in which they can add value, not just in terms of their lived experience, but they are very often very excellent program managers. They are CEOs of organizations, and they will challenge your assumptions, which is very important when we start talking about technology innovation in the human rights context. If you're working with a nonprofit and there aren't people with lived experience on it, ask why not. It's important. So part of this process of co-developing technology, in my experience, it builds a culture of trust in the technology. If an organization doesn't have that trust in it, if your technology is just a black box, right, and no one quite understands how it works, then people will be real reluctant to sort of invest their business models, their work into it, and it won't be so successful. So being transparent about how, for example, AI privacy works, where the data is being stored, is very, very important. So I think that sort of the next important point I want to raise, and this might sound obvious, but make sure the technology is actually useful. So one of the first NGOs that I worked with was a very small organization called Destiny Foundation in Kolkata. And the CEO said to me at that point, don't build anything that's ornamental, meaning don't build something that's just pretty, but isn't actually have any utility. And it's not harmless if you do that. If you're working with a nonprofit and it's something, it's look good, right, with lots of impressive graphics and other things, but doesn't actually help, you're still using that nonprofit's time, right? It's not harmless. You're still consuming effort and time. So getting in and defining scope with that nonprofit really early, making sure that it fits within their existing business models and approaches and impact models is super important and is much more likely to result in a successful application. Sometimes simple solutions are going to be far better. We don't always need AI. The most common tool probably in the nonprofit space is, well, apart from email, I suppose, and phones, but it is spreadsheets. That's a tool which organizations trust, which is why they're so prevalent around nonprofits. So don't discount simple solutions. Sometimes if that gets 90% of the way there, it could be the better option. The second thing I think is don't try and build something that becomes a burden, right? I've seen organizations burdened with technology, which they become dependent on, but can't maintain. And I think that's really my third point here. And this is where it's hard, is that trying to build technology that's maintainable You have to make sure that the technology that you're developing with an organization is appropriate for that organization. So, building 100,000 lines of Python code and handing that over to a very small organization might not be the best approach. Maybe there's something different and more applicable. It has to be maintainable. Now, with AI technology, I think actually there are new ways, right, in which organizations can help maintain that type of technology. For example, agentic AI software are using system prompting to maintain safeguarding and certain behaviors related to agents like chatbots. That is language, natural language being used essentially as programming. Make that accessible, right? Help people co-develop AI using AI, right? Using the inbuilt abilities of these tools. Try and make these tools as transparent as possible, so that people understand how this stuff is working, so that trust can be developed. Sometimes that can become at the cost of functionality, and if that's necessary, that's okay if it helps building a trustworthy system. And when you're thinking about maintenance in the future, as part of this project, don't just think about what the tool is doing when it's running. Think about the overall life cycle of a tool. In this sector, in the anti-slavery sector, we have a graveyard of tools on app stores, on websites, and other things which are not maintained because either budgets run out or, frankly, because we hadn't thought about what happens when that technology needs to be replaced, or how do we safely switch it off. Now, this is important. It's not as sexy as talking about, building brand new stuff, but it is important because often these types of technologies, particularly with AI, are going to be using data. And sometimes some of that data is going to be sensitive. It's going to be personal identifiable data. And having a technology which is still on but not being used and is being forgotten about can create risk. So think about the overall life cycle of the tool, not just its functionality. Include that in the design and think about it. Again, thinking about what happens to the tool when it's turned off helps to create a level of trust with a non-profit organization, and avoiding the issue of just decomposing technology, if you like, causing harm. I think the only other thing I wanted to sort of add is to try during the development of technology, as well as involving sort of community organizers and local communities and people affected, try and think about strengthening the technical capabilities of an organization you're working with. And sometimes it's easy to sort of hold on, right, to your knowledge, because sometimes it's a feeling of a power, right? There's a power structure there. So when you're budgeting and thinking about technology being developed for a nonprofit, think about strengthening the overall technology capabilities of that organization, particularly in the context of the tech you're building. You will probably find, there are some people who are on their journey of being a technologist there. Try and identify those and help them understand how to maintain this type of technology. They can be your biggest champions for getting certain types of technology implemented and successful. So those are my three areas I think I wanted to cover. Don't build in a vacuum. Working with human rights experts and nonprofits. Make sure the technology is genuinely useful. Keep it simple. Don't overburden it with technology which isn't essential to what's being done. Keep it maintainable. Think about the life cycle of that technology, particularly in the context of AI and sensitive data. So thanks very much. I'll hand over back to Sebastian.
Thank you, Phil, for bringing so many new topics to consider, and especially because we were talking about, the need actually to like develop tools considering like ethical considerations, but also you are talking about what happens after we design those tools. So many times we focus on the ethical and responsible considerations during the design and the development, but not many organizations like think what is going to happen after, we put this in the market, or we provide this to the communities or to a company or to a city hall. I don't know. So thank you also for bringing that perspective, because we start like to understand that like responsible development and ethical development is something that starts with the design, but doesn't like stop or disappear when the tool is ready to go actually to the service of the communities. It is a continuous process that developers and innovators have to consider and actually embed in their design in their design process. Now, finally, Brian, sorry, you had to wait a lot today. That's why we play ACC. I saw your emotion, but we were preparing you like to wait a little bit because you were the last. So sorry about that.
Yeah,
But
no worries.
so, Brian, you have more than 25 years of experience in innovation, leadership, and an amazing track record of bringing technology to the fight against modern slavery. Do you mind sharing with the participants some of your projects and how to translate data into actionable insights?
Sure. Yeah. No, thanks for inviting me. And all the speakers have been fantastic. So just to explain how I became involved with this and things that projects I've done in this area. So in 2016, I was working for Thomson Reuters Labs. So Thomson Reuters is one of the world's largest curators of data for professional purposes. And in those days, they had the financial and risk group. So they had lots of financial data about companies. They have the news agency Reuters, obviously, which has been in over 100 countries for over 100 years. They have their legal division, which has a platform called Westlaw that has data from court cases, primarily in the U.S. and Canada, but elsewhere as well. And they have they have a risk division that has lots of sort of information about financial crimes and so on. And so as part of the mission of the labs, then we were in 2016, which is why I picked that date. That's when the UK Modern Slavery Act came out. And so we were asked, okay, so if companies are going to report what their, the risk of forced labor in their supply chains is, how are they going to do that? How will they make, how will they be able to evaluate the risk? And can we do something sitting on all of this amazing data to help them quantify their risk of forced labor and within their supply chains? And so we took basically all of the data that we could think of that might be relevant, financial data, filings that included, like where a company did business, news data, just news articles about companies, legal cases in which the company was involved, any kind of financial crime indictments or convictions that someone involved with the company was involved with. So overall, we had about 20 different data sets that were highly curated, year after year, very well maintained. And we also very crucially had a system of identifiers for companies. So if you're going to do sort of natural language processing over a lot of data in these in these different kinds of formats, you really need to understand, okay, this entity that's referenced here is the same entity as this entity that's referenced in this other thing. So, obviously there's lots of abbreviations and shorthands and just pronominal co-reference and things that need to be worked through. So we were lucky that Thomson Reuters had a well-maintained system of identifiers for companies called the PermID that they use to aggregate data on their platforms. And so we took PermIDs for the 3.5 million companies that Thomson Reuters tracks for its customers. So those are both all of the public companies in the world, plus a lot of private companies. They had each one had a permanent identifier and various known aliases for those companies, as well as a complete corporate hierarchy. So we were very lucky in being able to access all of that data. So then we took that and we went back and mined all of the data sources that I talked about, the legal filings, the financial filings, news articles, financial crime data, everything that we could think of. And we came up and we wanted to come up with a way to quantify the risk of forced labor in supply chains for all of those 3.5 million companies. And so the way we created a risk metric was we weighed the different types of evidence differently. So if someone was convicted of something that was a very high value piece of evidence, but of course there are very few prosecutions and convictions in forced labor. And if you were merely mentioned, say in social media or a blog post or something, someone says, I think this company uses forced labor, that was considered not as valuable, but still potentially interesting. So we weighed the evidence by source, and then we also weighed it by recency. So if you had an accusation that was 20 years ago, that counted for much less than if it was made last month. So we took it and had sort of an exponential time decay for weighing the evidence. So with that in mind, with the 3.5 million companies that we looked at, maybe I should pause and let the audience guess how many companies of that 3.5 million had any kind of forced labor risk based on the data that we looked at. Maybe you can put it in the chat if you have a guess. What percentage? 90%, 30%, 10%? 100%? 70%, I assume you mean? 40%, 80%? Okay, interesting. Yeah, so a lot of different guesses here, but the answer turned out to be less than 0.1% of the companies, of the 3.5 million companies that we looked at, had any evidence whatsoever linking them to forced labor in their supply chains. So obviously, what we learned from this is that just by using this kind of publicly available information and stitching it together, using pretty reasonable and intensive methods, only gets you so far. In fact, doesn't get you very far at all, because we know that the risk of forced labor in supply chains involves way more than 0.1% of the world's companies. So what did we learn from this? Well, one, it's no surprise that supply chains are very opaque, right? So who a company sources their their raw materials and so on from is a trade secret, and it's not something that companies necessarily want to divulge. Some companies do make some of their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers public, but that's also very rare. And moreover, most of the risk of forced labor comes at the very beginnings of supply chains. It's at the sort of extraction and very low level processing of materials and so on, where you find most of the supply chain risk. So that in general is opaque to companies, even themselves, they don't really know where a lot of the, public companies, to some extent, really don't understand where the materials that they process comes from at the very end of their supply chains. So even though, this seemed like a worthwhile project and something useful for companies to do to quantify their forced labor risk, it really was missing. And even though we had access to a huge amount of very highly curated and well-maintained data, the data that really would be necessary to understand forced labor risk was missing from these kinds of publicly available information sources. So what does that lead to? So on the one hand, you could potentially try to create data that would cover all of the supply chain. And so in a different project, we did work on a scheme to go in and use blockchain technology to have companies document exactly which components in a supply chain, where exactly they came from, down to we were considering coffee, for example. So down to each coffee plantation would use these kinds of there are these self-assigned identifiers that you can use to register things on a blockchain. Didn't have to be the Bitcoin blockchain, some kind of blockchain where this entire supply chain would be transparent. So unfortunately, that project was getting going right as COVID was happening, and so it never really happened. But there have been some uses of blockchain within supply chain monitoring, even within, so the Customs and Border Protection Agency in the US did some prototypes of using blockchain to monitor supply chains. And one thing that revealed was that in order to get people to sign on to this kind of effort, you need to provide some incentives, right? So why would someone take the time to register every transaction on a blockchain? They're not going to do it unless there's something that they're getting out of it. Well, one thing that the Customs and Border Protection proofs of concept showed was that by using blockchain, it actually made the whole system much more efficient. And so companies got a great deal of efficiency out of it. And so there was an incentive to do that. But I don't believe that actually this has been adopted further. So if that would be one way to gather, to create the data that you need to have transparency all the way up the supply chain. But I don't think that has gone forward in the way that people would like. There are, so in order to really push these kinds of efforts further, you really need to get creative about data and data sources and what you can exploit. And also have in mind that data needs to be reliably gathered and regathered. So having a data set that you only collect once is not going to really get you anywhere, because it's only if you can repeatedly collect this data that it becomes really useful. So you need to really, if you're going to do projects in this area, you really need to be creative about where you can get data. We've done other projects in recent years where we looked at, for example, the fishing data from Global Fishing Watch. So Global Fishing Watch is a really great resource, and it makes a lot of data public about fishing vessels and where they are and how long they're in a particular area. And you can, cross-reference that data with ship registries and so on. And so you can get a feel for who's fishing in this area? Does the pattern of behavior of these vessels lead me to think that maybe they're doing, they're going out to sea for long periods with, forced labor on board that is not allowed to get off the boat and so on. So that's a sort of set of data that, will take a lot of effort. It's not, it doesn't just come pre-processed for, aggregating forced labor risk. But if you really wanted to look at forced labor in the fishing industry, that's something that you could actually do. Another example is just to look at where there are public records that you can could exploit for these purposes effectively. So my colleagues at Thomson Reuters Special Services, for example, did a project in which they looked at licenses for massage parlors and massage parlor workers. So there's a lot of illicit massage parlors, for example, where people are exploited to work in them. They're brought over from overseas and forced to work in these massage parlors, and so that's a case of forced labor. Often, it's very hard to tell from the outside whether a massage parlor, a massage company is legitimate or not, and the legitimate massage industry is very conscious of they don't want to be lumped together with the illicit massage businesses. What my colleagues at Thomson Reuters Special Services found was that if you looked at the patterns of licensing information that state governments require in some states in the U.S., there were clear patterns of cohabitation and so on among the workers that very clearly indicated which companies were probably doing something very shifty and which companies were legitimate. So again, that wouldn't necessarily be the first data source that comes to mind, this kind of licensing information, and it's not super easy to get, but it is available and it is maintained, and it can be mined for these kinds of purposes. And so finally, I'll more or less end there. So I would say, the things that I'd like to emphasize is that AI-driven projects in this area require, well-maintained data. It's going to require, if you're going to do lots of named entity recognition and looking at companies and identifying companies and so on, you're going to need some sort of system of identifiers to be able to distinguish the same entity that's mentioned in different ways. And thirdly, rely on, try to be creative about where the data comes from and to what extent the data is adequate to the purpose that you're going to be putting it to. So for example, just to go back to my original example, so it's very hard to see the entire supply chain from the kind of publicly available information sources we have about sort of top level companies that are tracked by the financial industry. But so figuring out how to make those supply chains transparent is really important for understanding forced labor risk. So that's all I have.
Wow, that's a lot to digest, actually, and there are many valuable insights that we can extract for what you said. But one that really resonates with me, and I think that connects with conversations that we had yesterday and this morning, like at 1 a.m. our time, is that, as you know, companies are not necessarily reporting information that actually help stakeholders to understand if they are linked or not to modern slavery. And you mentioned that it's really important to explore other sources of information, external information that help us to, have a better vision of the potential connections of companies and industries. to modern slavery. And I just want to take advantage of your comment to mention something, and is that we have a blue sky challenge here, and I think that actually trying to integrate like other sources of information, maybe to AIMS project, apart from the information that the tool is collecting from the modern slavery statements, could be a quite interesting move. Obviously, not the easiest one, as you, Ryan, say, because it is really challenging actually to find good sources of information and to validate that the information is useful. But I mean, it's just an idea that come to my mind when I hear you to say that. So thank you very much to all for sharing that wonderful experience. And we have 15 minutes left. So I would love to ask you a couple of questions, actually one question for each of you and one transversal question for everyone. And I have to say something before actually I go to the questions, and is Davor, come on, you made me want to take vacations. It's like you are very relaxed on the beach there. I really want to go to the beach and just relax. But it looks really nice. You look very comfortable in the session, so that's wonderful. I hope that's the same feeling of all the participants in this call. So Jerome, you mentioned something really important, and is the engagement with the communities. What you said is actually designing for communities first. And I would like to ask you, how do you interact with communities when designing tech-based solutions? How do you engage with them along the design and implementation process? And I'm going to give you a little bit more of context of these questions. Like a common complaint of communities when they are involved in this kind of processes is like they say like, oh, a researcher or a university come to my community, ask questions, I took a survey, I shared my knowledge, my ideas, and I never saw that organization again. You extract like information, but you never give back to the communities actually what you designed working with them. That's something that happens in several regions. So that's why I am asking, how do you manage that relation with the communities, and how do you make sure like to give back to them at the end of the process?
Yeah, that's a great one. I mean, I think there's two things. In some projects, we literally had, people from the communities as project members. So they were part of almost like the daily scrums, and they were core members of the core team that was working on the project. So concerned, like they were, had the same role as, a designer or a PM or, an engineer or a scientist on the team. So, but, this is very taking, like you need to, to be involved. And so, this meant that they were, that was part of their job, at least, that, they were working with us. So not everyone has that level of time or commitment or involvement that they want to do. And, same on the other side, of course, this, you need to be, paid, for all of that. So, it does have a bit of challenges, but for sure, if you can have people, from the communities being involved in some shape or form, within the actual, project team, I think that's ideal. Then again, I think the other thing is just how you govern your project. So, we would have steering codes every month, and we would have people, either they were from the communities or they were from the non-for-profits that we were working with, joining us during these steering codes, so that all of the information that we found, on the ground could be surfaced back, and, some of the progress also made on the projects being shared there. And so the overall governance of the project should be made in a way where you always facilitate, exposures and, opportunities for feedback from the people you go. I think other thing also is when we say engage, usually what that means is we can do that directly, just through reach outs, or also by working through non-for-profits that are already quite invested in the different communities. When we meet with the community member, we might plan, a follow-up interview session further down the line when the project has made some significant progress. And so I think it's just, ideally they're not just there at the very beginning of the project, which is like the exploration phase of like, yeah, let's learn about this space, but they actually have an opportunity of seeing the project go through. So, mocks is for me like a good way of doing this, where we could go quickly with some, initial inspiration of what we believe the impact might be. I love what Mayank shared about the different screens and like how the data is being perceived. So, I would assume that this is things that you want to de-risk, as soon as possible. So sharing that, even if it's all fake data in the back, but just see how they take that in and like what kind of insights it asks them, I think can be very useful. But then, as you go through the different phases of the project, once you're in the development phase, well, hopefully you'll have some usability sessions, or you'll still interact with the communities to see how the product is or the technology is being perceived. And so, or if they're not, at least you scope that at the very beginning, right? Saying like, you're part of a bigger project. Maybe we do this for policymakers, but we just want to make sure we have your insights there. And like, here's how we plan on engaging with you along the way. Anyways, so I think there's a few ways you could go about this. But at least on our side, it was always been like, can they either be part of the team as itself, or we have steer co's where they are there, or we already know that this is a 6 months project or a year project. We expect to be able to have some first mock-up of the product at this point. Let's follow up with the next interview session at that.
Okay, that makes totally sense. It is also about, like setting clear expectations for them as well, and like the scope of the project. So yeah, that makes totally sense. Davor, you mentioned the POC framework or approach actually to evaluate promising AI solutions. And I would like to ask you, what are some of the key ethical considerations that you take into account when evaluating like tech-based solutions based on your POC approach? And obviously, like this apply, maybe if you have some experience with particular solutions applied to the fight against modern slavery.
It's a really good question, but I don't have a specific answer, in the sense that with each company, which is, a partner, with each partner you work, it's always different. And it's more or less on the level of, like Jérôme said, on the level of the team that is working on the POC. Whether sometimes they do understand that there could be ethical issues. Sometimes they do think about them in terms of the company, not of the POC. There's a lot of like business thinking in between, and probably a bit of, like consciousness checking. But in general, what we try to say to them is that even though it's a very, very soft policy, we try to revert to the UNESCO recommendation in the ethics of AI, which is, I mean, in business circles and in general, it's just like probably not really present, or even like, people don't think about that, because it's a very soft type of policy, and it doesn't really pin down the principles into the sort of like, mathematics of machine learning. So it's more of a checkup for each team member. I think this is what I've noticed. They'd say, "Oh yeah, actually we should be thinking about this. What do you think, guys?" And then this, from that point of view, from the almost humanist point of view, they start to like create like a checklist. But it's again, it's very different for every single team, I'd say. But that's
Okay,
my experience.
Yeah, no. But I think it would be wonderful. Actually, we are going to, I guess, like the recommendations in terms of ethical development that you mentioned are available to the public, right? Because it
Yeah.
would be awesome to share them with our participants. That's a wonderful starting point. As you know, we have participants with different like levels of expertise in the development of tech solutions. So it would be wonderful actually to share those guidelines so they can consider at least
Yeah.
those elementary points to
Okay, yeah.
along the
And I
competition.
think I think a lot of I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff that Allison was saying. I think that really resonates in the sense of user research. Like people just start thinking about what they're doing aside of the AI component. And that's the space where they sort of like try and think about the ethics and responsible AI and so forth. And so that's a big thing that I've noticed as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Davor. Mayank, how do you balance the technical capacity that obviously your solution has of scrapping large volumes of online content with the ethical responsibility of avoiding over collection of sensitive or private data?
So it's a trade-off, right? So and this is why it's very important to think about the users, because in some sense, any piece of data is we're not getting informed consent, right? When we are collecting sex ads, right? I mean, you're not going to the sex workers and telling them that we're going to collect your ads and so on and so forth, right? So here it's a balance of like what is appropriate and who do you give access to the data and whether it's gone through ethical review and so on. And unfortunately, there is no golden solution to this. Like if you don't collect data or do any of that, then you can't catch the traffickers. It's not like the medical field, right? So the people who are being trafficked did not give informed consent, to being trafficked, right? So how do you catch them, right? And so that sensitive data, or in this case, anything which is on the web, right, and involves a point of contact, which, and this is a very physical business, right? So we have not dealt with things like open fans and open only fans or things like that. It's this is a physical business where the victim or the potential victim is usually putting the phone number on some ad or some contact detail, and then the person who is a potential customer can contact them, and then there is some kind of physical rendezvous, right? So it's a dangerous business, and it is and you saw in some of the news articles I showed, where there was a customer, who turns out to be a serial killer, right? And then this person goes missing, and then who is there really, right? The trafficker moves on, okay, distant, and so it's a very hard problem. I think in general, the only thing you can do is to do the best you can, and there is no, I think that it's the wrong way to, it would be a mistake to think that there is actually a golden solution. I think that it's a very deeply, it's a problem with deep ethical conundrums, and you have to like discuss it and think about it, and then at some point take an approach which balances risks and benefits. Even technically, by the way, right? I think that there is no technical solution to any such problem. I think that it all combines technical with legal. Any technology can be misused by anyone. That's just a fact of life. There is nothing you can do to prevent any good technology from being misused by anyone, whether it's ChatGPT being misused to create cyber attacks, or recently someone committed suicide because they had a conversation with ChatGPT and really got into it. So what can you do, right? Is it that, okay, we're not going to allow ChatGPT to talk about anything related to mental health? Well, if you do that, then a whole suite of applications, suddenly go out the window. There are people who use ChatGPT for therapy, and they're like, I want to talk to a human, but I am willing to talk to an AI, right? So there are many people like that, right? So it's, I think with any powerful technology, like any fan of science fiction, you can see this in many episodes, many books, many conversations, etc., right? That there is no technical, legal, social solution to truly prevent misuse. Like just period, full stop, right? So the only thing you can do is have some guardrails, to balance trade-offs, to be careful about users, to be careful about what you're collecting, do no harm as much as possible, be very minimal in some sense. And, and there are many ethicists, obviously, who have views on this, but it's a very hard problem. There is no solution. So I think pretending there's a solution is in itself unethical, or that there's a black and white solution that, we just build a system that it's not possible to misuse. We'll just build a system that will not collect any sensitive data beyond what is needed to catch trafficking on its face, right? It's not, that statement is not inappropriate, right? Of course, we would like to do that. Can we build a system where we are not collecting anything other than what we need to catch traffickers? Can we? I don't think so, right? Not with current technology. So to pretend that we can, is the ultimate, in my view, breach of ethics, because you're just being unrealistic, and the whole conversation would shut down because someone might say, well, you can't do it, so you should not do it. And we'll just wait, 50 years before we have some magical technology that can do that. And in the meantime, if many trafficking victims die, simply because we are going to sit on our high horses and say that there is some privacy problem here, then think about that, right? That's an ethical conundrum, a big ethical conundrum. So it's a very hard problem. There's no, you have to think about these things and talk to people, and ultimately there are hard decisions that have to be made.
Okay, thank you, Mayank, for sharing your perspective. And without doubt, this is also about who you partner with. I mean, you mentioned in your presentation, like you are sharing this information with very trusted organizations that actually have the mandate and that are legally obligated and responsible to investigate those crimes. So this is also about who you share this information with, to make sure that obviously like the things that are kind of out of our control, because obviously we need to collect that information, are like managed in the best way possible with the partners we work with. Phil, you mentioned something very interesting, and it was like we need to foster technical capabilities in the organizations if we want actually to promote the adoption of technology. What are the most crucial technical capabilities that a nonprofit organization should develop before adopting technological tools to combat modern slavery? I know that that's a challenging one. There is no a specific set, but if you have to select a top 3 or a top 5 tools or skills that they should have, what those skills should be?
Oh, that's a great question. So first of all, nonprofit organizations vary enormously in sort of size and complexity. So some organizations have developed themselves quite sophisticated systems of identifying potential victims through, for example, helplines and social media, as well as offerings to businesses providing analytics and so on. Whereas others are frontline, they work in communities, and the technology use might be using more consumer-related technology, depending upon the organization. So it does vary. Some of the areas which I would always advise nonprofit to help focus on, if they can, is basic analytics. So nonprofits need to always face challenges around collecting information to demonstrate impact, and that's a data exercise, and sometimes it's quite a complex data exercise. Organizations also need to measure vulnerability in their communities as well through surveys and so on. So often sort of quite sophisticated analytics systems to be able to do that beyond just sort of simple spreadsheets. So I think that is definitely sort of a technical tool that can be useful. I think you will see right now organizations in the nonprofit sector tackling forced labor, for example, are already using chatbots to help migrant workers, for example, navigate the process of applying for jobs in a safe way. So I would also sort of encourage nonprofits to think not just in terms of technical skills, but research around what's possible with technology. I think knowing what's out there is incredibly useful, and having that sort of being inquisitive to do that is really important. And some of the sort of the best innovations I've seen haven't been bespoke technologies. They've been using off-the-shelf products in an innovative way and integrating them with their organizations. And being able to do that is very, very useful. So yeah, does that answer your question, Sebastian? I'm not sure if it did, but hopefully.
No. You did. Thank you very much, Phil. And last one, I know that we run out of time, but Brian, I know you already addressed part of this actually question in your presentation, but from a data perspective, what should modern slavery statements requirements include to make companies report information that actually help identify if the companies are linked to modern slavery? I know that this is challenging, that this is about the legislation, but if you could ask like companies to include, I don't know, a certain or a specific information in their modern slavery statements, what it should be that really would be helpful, like to identify if they are really linked to modern slavery or not.
Well, I mean, so I think the biggest thing that they could do would be to disclose their entire supply chain down to the very earliest suppliers. But of course, they're not required to do that, and they're not going to do that. So, I mean, I think Adriana's done a great job in coming up with this project of just normalizing modern slavery statements and seeing, being able to extract the data points that are in them in order for us to be able to do sector analysis, company analysis, and so on. I think this is a really great goal, and obviously, the more that you can point out to a company that your modern slavery statement is defective in these ways, everyone else reports this, but you don't. Companies respond well to shaming. So I think that's an important tool, and probably really one of the few levers that we have here. And so I'll go with that. I'll just say one more thing. If you're building some kind of risk metric for companies, obviously you potentially face pushback from the companies that are being evaluated, especially if they're a negative evaluation. So I would just say, just make sure that your methodology is transparent. You can't just publish black box scores that this company is high risk, this company is low risk. You have to explain what the methodology is. It has to be understandable. All the evidence that goes into those metrics needs to be disclosable. And you will get pushback, but if you keep those things in mind, you'll probably survive, which is important.
Thank you, Brian, for that. Yeah, that makes totally sense. It is not only about the information that you share, but also like sharing with your stakeholders. How do you get that information? And that's something that we often don't see in the modern slavery statements. So Davor, Brian, Phil, thank you very much for staying until the end. And thank you also to Jérôme, to Allison, and to Allison, yes, for joining this session, and to Mayank. It was an incredible one. I know it was a long conversation, but super, super insightful. So thank you again for being part of this competition, for sharing your experience and your pieces of advice with our participants. Obviously, we are going to keep you posted about the progress of the competition and the results of it. It was a pleasure to share my afternoon, I guess your afternoon, also with such an amazing group of panelists and experts, and we hope to stay in touch.